A single candle flickers in the darkened hallway of a quiet house in Orléans, France. Imagine the hush of midnight air interrupted by a single gunshot, its echo bouncing off silent walls, splitting a marriage and a city in two. What compels a gentle spirit to pull the trigger against the one they once vowed to love? Tonight, we uncover the story of a woman whose desperate act rocked a nation, leaving a legacy both haunting and impossible to forget. Yvonne Chevallier was born in a modest French household at the end of World War I, a time when the country was desperate to rebuild, both materially and morally. She was raised in a culture shaped by traditional norms, where a woman's destiny was often tied to her husband's reputation. In her early teens, she devoured romantic novels, dreaming of love stories that might rescue her from small-town monotony. When she met the charismatic and ambitious Pierre, a medical professional with political dreams, she was drawn in by his sophistication. Their union, in the late 1930s, seemed to promise everything: love, stability, and a future bigger than their humble origins. But the weight of those unfulfilled promises would one day ignite into a tragedy that even Orléans, with its deep historical roots, could not ignore. From the outside, Yvonne and Pierre appeared like any other couple rising through the ranks of post-war French society. 6 critical moments, however, would define the fate of this marriage and the shocking violence that tore it apart. The first turning point came in the early 1940s during the occupation. War ravaged France, and so did fear, suspicion, and emotional strain. Pierre, who worked tirelessly as a physician treating wounded soldiers and desperate civilians, was hailed for his unyielding bravery. Yvonne was proud, so proud that she found meaning in her role as the supportive wife. She wrote letters to distant friends praising Pierre's altruism, describing him as a beacon of hope in a world unraveling. Yet, beneath her glowing words, she felt an undercurrent of isolation. Though she believed in Pierre's cause, she ached for a few stolen moments of tenderness that the war, and his newly launched political ambitions, did not allow. With the war's end, the second turning point arrived. Pierre capitalized on his wartime reputation and launched a serious campaign for local office. He was charming and persuasive, and as post-war Orléans yearned for forward-thinking leaders, Pierre's popularity soared. Yvonne watched in both admiration and apprehension. Each day, she stood beside him at gatherings, only to be nudged aside by swirling crowds of supporters. Where once she had offered him quiet support, she now felt relegated to a mere accessory. Friends and neighbors started calling him le sauveur, the savior, while Yvonne, overshadowed, vanished into the background. But she was not invisible in her own mind. Those illusions of romantic unity still glowed inside her, fueling a silent cry for attention. Around 1947, with Pierre officially installed in public office, the couple confronted their third turning point: the social and psychological costs of power. Yvonne expected her husband to settle into a more stable life once he'd achieved his dream. Instead, the demands multiplied. Pierre now had the eyes of Orléans upon him, and Yvonne recognized that her role had shifted from loyal confidant to political asset. She told a close friend, whose testimony would later form part of the official record, "I feel like I have no air to breathe, that I'm just another piece in the chessboard of his success." Although her words were said in hushed tones, they revealed a profound sadness that was edging toward desperation. She felt unfulfilled and increasingly distant from the man she loved. The fourth turning point arrived through a swirl of rumors. By 1949, whispers circulated that Pierre had taken a mistress, a cultured young woman who moved gracefully through the city's upper social circles. At first, Yvonne brushed off the gossip, but she could not help noticing the subtle changes in her husband's routine. late-night sessions at the office, weekend trips that he claimed were for party fundraisers. These excuses gave her mind plenty of fodder for suspicion. Gradually, the rumors solidified into certainty. She confronted him one night trembling, but was met with a detached shrug. "You're imagining things," he reportedly said, dismissing her accusations as a product of her own loneliness. In truth, Yvonne feared she was no longer merely lonely. She was trapped in a house where every wall seemed to mock her irrelevance. The fifth turning point came in 1950, when Yvonne's health, and perhaps her mental well-being, began to decline. Neighbors recalled seeing her pace anxiously in the garden, her fingers clenched into fists, as though she were trying to wring out her anguish. She took to writing in a journal, a habit from her youth, and those private scribblings would later be used in her trial as evidence of her deteriorating emotional state. "He leaves in the morning and returns at midnight," she wrote in one entry. "I watch him, drifting from me. I want to scream, but who would listen?" Increasingly, Yvonne's frustration centered not just on Pierre's suspected infidelity, but on the sense that the world conspired to keep her silent. For all her tears, the city of Orléans only had ears for its revered mayor. Then came the sixth and final turning point on the night of August 2nd, 1951. She was in the sitting room, twisting her wedding ring in circles, half hoping her husband would walk in with an apology or a gesture of warmth. When he did return, Pierre looked spent and impatient. They argued. The details of their exchange are conflicting, with some witnesses stating Yvonne accused him of humiliating her in public, others claiming she begged him for a sign of love. But everyone agrees the dispute escalated. In a moment, loaded with anguish, she retrieved the pistol he kept in the dresser drawer, an item that had once symbolized his war heroism. With trembling hands and a tear-streaked face, she fired a single shot. The echo rang through the corridor. Pierre staggered, pressing his hand against his chest, surprise flickering in his eyes. He collapsed and the house fell silent. The immediate aftermath turned Yvonne's home into a scene of horror and heartbreak. She knelt by Pierre, sobbing, pressing a shaking hand to his pale cheek. When authorities arrived, she did not resist. She was taken into custody without a word. The next days were a blur of interrogation and media frenzy. Reporters swarmed the police station, the courthouse, and the very street where Yvonne had lived. A cloak of shock settled over Orléans. How could the mayor, the wartime hero, be felled by his own wife? As the investigation deepened, small details emerged that added layers to the tragedy. The staff had noticed tension for months, hearing muffled arguments late at night. Close colleagues of Pierre hinted that he had indeed been straying from the marriage, but no one wanted to confirm it openly, lest they tarnish his revered image. Some pointed to Yvonne's mounting despair as a madness, while others saw a woman cornered by emotional betrayal and public neglect. To the press, she was either a scorned wife or a cold-blooded murderess, and the truth was seldom more than a convenient headline. The trial opened in early 1952, drawing crowds so large that the local gendarmerie struggled to maintain order. Yvonne appeared gaunt and subdued. She dressed modestly, her eyes perpetually fixed on the floor. In a strained voice, she recounted their early romance, painting a picture of a once loving union. She wept openly when describing the war years, speaking fondly of her pride in Pierre's devotion to his country. But her demeanor hardened when the prosecutor questioned her about the rumors of her husband's affair. She insisted that she had not planned to kill him, that the shot was a tragically impulsive act fueled by heartbreak. "I only wanted him to see me," she told the court. "I only wanted him to hear me." Various witnesses took the stand. Pierre's political allies portrayed him as a saintly figure who had been tragically victimized by his wife's jealousy. Yvonne's childhood friends told a different story, describing her as a gentle soul who had lost her bearings in a marriage overshadowed by political ambition. Family members gave conflicting accounts. Some condemned her outright, while others expressed sorrowful understanding for the mental toll that years of disregard and rumored infidelity had inflicted. When the mistress was called to testify, she maintained a cold composure, claiming she and Pierre had only been colleagues. Yet she stopped short of denying intimate involvement, leaving the court to read between the lines. The defense strategy hinged on depicting Yvonne as a woman driven to despair, with some speculation about her mental health. Psychological experts testified that she showed signs of severe anxiety, possibly bordering on what would now be recognized as a major depressive disorder. Under pressure, her ability to reason could have been impaired. The prosecutor countered that heartbreak alone does not justify murder. He pointed to the methodical nature of retrieving the gun and aiming it. This was no accident, he insisted. It was the deliberate act of someone who wanted her husband's success all to herself. Throughout the trial, the public devoured every sensational detail. Newspapers carried lurid headlines like "A Mayor Shot by Love" and "Jealousy in Orléans." In taverns and kitchens across France, people debated Yvonne's guilt or innocence. Was she an unhinged figure who tarnished the memory of a war hero? Or was she, like so many women of that era, crushed under the weight of traditional expectations, driven to extremes in a final attempt to reclaim her dignity? Court proceedings stretched on for weeks, culminating in a dramatic day of verdict and sentencing. The judge recognized the weight of public scrutiny, urging the jury to strip away the sensationalism and focus on the facts. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty. However, the sentence reflected the nuanced view that Yvonne's act, while criminal, sprang from a deep pit of psychological torment. The court handed down a prison term that, though severe, fell short of the maximum penalty. A hush spread across the courtroom when the sentence was read, followed by the murmurs of onlookers grappling with their own conflicted feelings. Behind bars, Yvonne retreated into a quiet life. Over time, she was allowed limited access to books and corresponded sparingly with a few loyal friends. One letter, made public decades later, revealed haunting reflections. "I did not just kill a man. I killed the bond that once gave me hope. If I could trade my breath for his, I would." That singular sentence spoke volumes about the regret that gnawed at her, and the impossible longing to undo what had been done. Even as Yvonne served her sentence, the court of public opinion was anything but unanimous. Some believed that no personal anguish could excuse such an act, while others, often women who identified with Yvonne's plight, expressed empathy for the desperation that had led her to violence. In time, the frenzy around the case subsided, but the questions it raised lingered in the collective memory. The story of a prominent public figure brought low by domestic tragedy remained seared into Orléans' conscience. By the mid-1950s, rumors of possible parole circulated. Yvonne did eventually gain early release, though specific details were sparse. She emerged frail and visibly aged beyond her years. Choosing a life of seclusion, she disappeared from public view, leaving behind the whispers and rumors, the headlines and trial transcripts that had once consumed an entire nation. As the doors of prison closed behind her, so too did a chapter of French history marked by heartbreak, betrayal, and the tragic consequences of a single shot fired in the dead of night. What followed was an emotional fallout that reached well beyond Yvonne's own grief. Pierre's relatives, once proud of his heroism, became embroiled in a struggle to salvage his name from the shadows cast by marital scandal. Grief counselors, rare at the time, were brought in to help younger members of the family cope, while older relatives chose stoic silence, as though discussing it would only give the tragedy more power. Yvonne's extended family split into factions. Some visited her in prison, others disowned her altogether. Private diaries and letters from that period show an array of raw, conflicting emotions: guilt, sorrow, shame. In Orléans, the Chevallier home stood empty for months, a silent monument to a love story gone horribly awry. Meanwhile, the controversy that had ignited in the media was not easily quelled. In cafe debates and newspaper editorials, people argued whether the justice system had been too lenient or too harsh. Feminist circles, still nascent in early 1950s France, quietly invoked Yvonne's case as an example of how women's mental and emotional well-being could be neglected in a marriage dominated by male power and prestige. Conservative commentators, in contrast, decried any sympathy for a woman who took her husband's life, warning that moral decay lay at the heart of such a crime. Political rivals of Pierre's party tried to spin the tragedy for their own ends, accusing local officials of burying details that might have cast him in a more negative light. The trial, in many respects, turned into a mirror that reflected the fractured values and tensions of post-war France. Over the years, the story of Yvonne and Pierre took on a curious afterlife. Some playwrights, novelists, and filmmakers flirted with adapting the saga, weaving it into a broader tapestry of French post-war identity. Legal scholars sometimes cited her trial in discussions about the role mental health plays in crimes of passion, a subject that, at the time, was largely unexplored. On a smaller scale, locals in Orléans passed down whispered recollections to their children and grandchildren, cautionary tales about the darkness that can lurk behind the facade of marital bliss. The case even influenced a handful of emerging politicians, who recognized that ambition without personal balance could lead to a downfall as swift and devastating as a single gunshot. Though its direct legal repercussions were limited, the cultural and psychological resonances endured, echoing through the city's collective memory. As for Yvonne, her later years remain shrouded in a mix of rumor and speculation. Some say she found a quiet life in a convent. Others claim she remarried and tried to start anew under a different name. Historical records are sparse, leaving her final fate as one last mystery in a story overflowing with them. Yet her impact on discussions of love, betrayal, and the limits of human endurance remains profound. By forcing a society to confront the hidden turmoil behind a polished political marriage, she sparked conversations that continue to resonate in subtle yet unmistakable ways. Can we ever truly understand the desperation that drives a person to commit the unthinkable? Does heartbreak excuse homicide, or merely demand our deeper empathy for everyone caught in its deadly vortex? The crimes of Yvonne Chevallier remain an indelible mark on France's collective conscience, a tragedy born of shattered vows and suppressed cries. As we step away from this story, we're left with a single haunting truth. Beneath every public triumph, a private storm may be brewing, and sometimes it's the tempest no one sees that leaves the deepest scars.